The morning briefing at RAF Koningsby felt different. Squadron leader Marcus Harding scanned the faces of his pilots, noting the tension that hung in the air like smoke from afterburners. Intelligence had been sketchy for weeks, unconfirmed radar signatures over the North Sea, commercial flights reporting mysterious contrails at impossible altitudes, and now this. A priority scramble order that arrived without explanation at 400 hours. "Gentlemen," Harding began, then caught himself. "And lady, we have an unusual situation developing approximately 200 nautical miles northeast of our position." Flight Lieutenant Kestrel Voss sat in the back row, her dark eyes fixed on the tactical display showing scattered red markers across a maritime grid. She'd earned her place among the Typhoon pilots through sheer determination, but whispers still followed her through the corridors. Whispers about her father's disgrace, about women in combat roles, about the shadow patch sewn beneath her name tape that no one quite understood. The patch depicted a falcon diving through storm clouds, its wings folded in perfect symmetry. Most assumed it was squadron insignia they didn't recognize. They were wrong. At 3:47 this morning, HMS Defender reported multiple high-speed contacts approaching from bearing 095. The contacts disappeared from radar approximately 12 minutes later, but not before registering speeds that should be impossible for conventional aircraft. Harding's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen enough combat to know when something didn't add up. Wing Commander Sarah Phillips, the station's senior intelligence officer, stepped forward. Her expression was grave. "What makes this particularly concerning is the timing. These incursions have been escalating over the past month, always probing our response patterns, always vanishing before positive identification." Kestrel shifted slightly, her fingers unconsciously tracing the shadow patch. She'd seen those radar signatures before, in a different war, under different circumstances. The memory made her pulse quicken, not from fear, but from recognition. "Flight profiles suggest advanced stealth capabilities combined with unprecedented maneuverability," Phillips continued. "We're dealing with technology that shouldn't exist, at least not in any known inventory." The other pilots exchanged glances. Flight Lieutenant Davies whispered something about experimental Russian platforms. Squadron Leader Thompson mentioned Chinese hypersonics, but Kestrel remained silent, her mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with enemy aircraft and everything to do with ghosts she thought she'd buried in the mountains of Afghanistan. Outside, 4 Typhoon FGR-4s sat on the tarmac, their engines already spinning up for what everyone assumed would be a routine intercept mission. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete, and for just a moment, Kestrel could swear one of those shadows looked exactly like the patch on her flight suit. Something was coming, something that knew her better than she knew herself. The aircraft carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth had been operating in the Norwegian Sea for 3 weeks, part of a joint NATO exercise that was supposed to demonstrate Allied unity. Instead, it had become a magnet for whatever was stalking their airspace. Captain James Morrison stood on the bridge, watching his radar operators track contacts that behaved like nothing in their threat database. "Sir, we're showing 4 more signatures, bearing 270, altitude Angels 35 and climbing." The young petty officer's voice carried barely controlled excitement. "Speed. Christ, sir, they're indicating Mach 2.8 and accelerating." Morrison had commanded carrier battle groups through 2 decades of maritime operations. He'd seen Russian Tu-95s probe NATO defenses, watched Chinese J-20s dance around his fighter patrols, and coordinated responses to Iranian fast boats in the Persian Gulf. This was different. These contacts moved with purpose, as if they knew exactly where his defensive gaps were. "Communications, patch me through to RAF Koningsby. Tell them we need those Typhoons airborne now." The radio crackled with static as encrypted channels opened across the North Sea. Hundreds of miles away, Kestrel was already strapping herself into the cockpit of Typhoon ZK-356, her aircraft loaded with 4 ASRAAM air-to-air missiles and enough fuel for a 3-hour patrol. The familiar routine of pre-flight checks helped calm her racing thoughts, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something larger than a simple intercept mission. Her squadron commander's voice filled her headset. "Falcon 1-1, this is Viper lead. Weather is clear, seas moderate. Your vector will be 095 for 200 nautical miles. Once on station, maintain Angels 25 and await further instructions." "Copy, Viper lead. Falcon 1-1 ready for departure." The Typhoon's twin EJ-200 engines spooled to full power, and Kestrel felt the familiar surge of acceleration as 23,000 pounds of thrust pushed her aircraft down the runway. At rotation speed, she pulled back gently on the stick, and the fighter lifted into the gray morning sky above Lincolnshire. Behind her flew 3 other Typhoons, Davies in Falcon 1-2, Thompson in Falcon 1-3, and Mitchell in Falcon 1-4. They were good pilots, all of them, but they'd never seen what Kestrel had seen in the mountains above Kabul 7 years ago. They didn't carry shadow patches or wake up from dreams about aircraft that moved like living things. As the formation climbed through 15,000 feet, Kestrel caught her reflection in the canopy glass. Her father's eyes looked back at her, dark and determined. Group Captain Victor Voss had been the RAF's most decorated pilot until the incident that ended his career and nearly destroyed their family. The shadow patch was his legacy and his curse. Now, climbing toward whatever waited in the cold waters of the North Sea, Kestrel wondered if she was about to discover why he'd never spoken about that final mission. The first sign of trouble wasn't on radar. It was in the behavior of the birds. Seagulls that should have been following fishing trawlers instead wheeled in frantic circles, their cries carrying an edge of panic that made experienced fishermen check their safety equipment twice. The skipper of the Aberdeen-registered vessel Noorkop had been working these waters for 30 years, and he'd never seen anything like it. "Control, this is Noorkop. We're observing unusual wildlife behavior at position 58 degrees north, 02 degrees east. Birds are acting like there's a storm coming, but weather's clear as glass." The voice that responded from Aberdeen Maritime Control carried professional concern. "Noorkop, we show no weather disturbances in your area. Are you observing any unusual aircraft activity?" Before the skipper could respond, his radar operator called out from below deck. "Skip, you need to see this. I'm showing multiple contacts, high altitude, moving in formation. They're not squawking any identification codes." The contacts appeared as faint blips on the civilian radar display, barely distinguishable from sea clutter. But their movement pattern was unmistakable, a perfect diamond formation, maintaining precise spacing and altitude as they approached from the northwest. The radar operator had served in the Royal Navy before joining the fishing fleet, and he recognized tactical formations when he saw them. Meanwhile, Kestrel's Typhoon was 30 minutes out from the intercept coordinates, flying at 25,000 feet through air so clear she could see individual whitecaps on the ocean surface below. Her radar was painting a clean scope, no contacts, no electronic emissions, nothing to suggest hostile activity. But her instincts, honed through countless combat missions, were screaming warnings. "Falcon Flight, this is Viper Control. Be advised we're receiving multiple civilian reports of unusual aircraft activity in your patrol area. Maintain heightened alert status and report any contacts immediately." "Roger, Viper Control. Falcon 1-1 showing negative contacts at this time." But even as she spoke, Kestrel noticed something odd in her peripheral vision. The sun was casting shadows on her port wing, shadows that seemed to move independently of the aircraft's attitude. She adjusted her position slightly, banking left to get a better angle, and felt her blood freeze. There, barely visible against the aluminum skin of her wing, was a shadow that matched no part of her aircraft's profile. It was sleek and angular, with swept wings and a profile that belonged to no known fighter in any Air Force inventory. The shadow moved as if cast by something flying in perfect formation just above her, something her radar couldn't detect. Kestrel keyed her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surge. "Falcon Flight, this is 1-1. I'm observing unusual visual phenomena. Recommend we tighten formation and prepare for possible contact." The response from Falcon 1-2 carried skepticism. "Copy 1-1. We're not showing anything on scope." But Kestrel was already reaching for the shadow patch on her flight suit, her fingers finding the worn fabric that represented everything her father had tried to warn her about. The memories came flooding back as Kestrel watched the shadow dance across her wing. Afghanistan, 2018. She'd been a young flight lieutenant then, part of a reconnaissance mission deep in Taliban-controlled territory. The mission brief had been routine: photograph suspected weapons caches in the Panjshir Valley and return to Bagram. What they'd found instead had changed everything. Her father had been waiting in the debriefing room when she returned, his face carved from granite and his eyes holding secrets she was only beginning to understand. Group Captain Victor Voss wasn't supposed to be in Afghanistan. Officially, he was on medical leave following an incident that had ended his flying career. But there he sat, wearing civilian clothes and an expression that belonged on condemned men. "You saw them," he'd said without preamble. It wasn't a question. Kestrel had nodded, still shaking from the encounter. "The aircraft. They moved like nothing I've ever seen. My radar couldn't track them, but they were there. I have gun camera footage." "No, you don't." Her father's voice had been gentle but final. "The footage was corrupted during download, equipment malfunction. These things happen." That night, Victor had given her the shadow patch, a falcon diving through storm clouds, wings folded in perfect hunting posture. He'd sewn it beneath her name tape himself, his hands surprisingly steady for a man whose career had been destroyed by what the official reports called stress-induced hallucinations. "When they come for you," he'd whispered, "and they will come, remember that shadows can't exist without light. Find the light, Kess, find the source." Now, 7 years later, flying at 25,000 feet over the North Sea, Kestrel understood what her father had been trying to tell her. The shadow on her wing wasn't cast by sunlight. It was a reflection, a mirror image of something that existed in the spaces between radar sweeps and the gaps in human perception. She glanced at her formation partners, still flying in tight parade formation, their pilots oblivious to the presence that surrounded them. On her radar scope, 4 green-friendly symbols maintained perfect position, but the shadows told a different story. 8 aircraft were flying this mission. 4 were piloted by RAF officers with clean records and bright futures. The other 4 belonged to something else entirely, something that had been watching and waiting and learning since long before any of them had earned their wings. Kestrel's thumb moved to the weapons selector switch, not to engage, but to prepare. Whatever was coming, whatever had drawn her to this moment above the gray waters of the North Sea, it was connected to the secret her father had died protecting. The shadow on her wing shifted slightly, and for just a moment she could swear she saw a cockpit canopy and the silhouette of a pilot looking back at her. HMS Queen Elizabeth's Combat Information Center had become a hive of controlled chaos. Radar operators hunched over their displays, tracking contacts that appeared and disappeared with maddening irregularity. Captain Morrison stood behind the senior watch officer, his weathered hands gripping the back of a chair as he watched the tactical picture develop. "Sir, we're now showing 8 contacts in the intercept area. 4 are definitely our Typhoons. IFF signals are strong and clear. The other 4," the petty officer paused, rechecking his displays. "The other 4 are exactly matching their flight profiles. Same altitude, same heading, same speed. It's like they're flying in perfect formation." Morrison had seen enough naval aviation to know that kind of precision formation flying was nearly impossible, even for elite demonstration teams. The G-forces alone would make it extraordinarily difficult to maintain such tight spacing while maneuvering at combat speeds. Yet the radar picture showed 8 aircraft flying, as if they were connected by invisible cables. Communications. Are you maintaining contact with the Typhoon flight? Aye, sir. Falcon 11 reports visual contact with unidentified shadows, but no positive radar contacts. The other pilots in her flight are reporting negative contacts of any kind. Morrison frowned. In 30 years of naval service, he'd learned to trust the instincts of experienced pilots, especially combat veterans like Flight Lieutenant Voss. If she was reporting visual contacts that weren't showing on radar, there were only two possibilities. Either her aircraft systems were malfunctioning, or they were dealing with stealth technology more advanced than anything in the classified threat database. The tactical display updated, showing the 8 aircraft formation beginning a slow turn toward the southeast. The movement was coordinated with mathematical precision, each aircraft maintaining exactly the same distance and bearing from its neighbors. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "Sir," the radar operator called out, his voice tight with concentration, "I'm detecting some kind of electronic interference. It's subtle, but it's affecting our long-range search radar, almost like someone is learning our frequencies." Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the North Sea air conditioning. Electronic warfare was a constant reality in modern naval operations, but this was different. This felt less like jamming and more like observation, as if something was quietly cataloging their capabilities without interfering with their operations. On the flight deck above, ordnance crews were already preparing additional F-35 Lightning fighters for launch. The sleek stealth fighters represented the cutting edge of naval aviation, equipped with sensors and weapon systems that could theoretically detect and engage even the most advanced threats. But as Morrison watched the tactical display, he wondered if conventional thinking about air combat was about to become obsolete. The radio crackled with a transmission from Falcon 11. "Viper Control, this is Falcon 11. I'm observing multiple shadow contacts maintaining formation with my flight. Recommend we alter course to test their response." Before Control could respond, Morrison grabbed the handset. "Falcon 11, this is HMS Queen Elizabeth Actual. Can you describe the nature of these shadow contacts?" Kestrel's voice came back steady and professional, but Morrison could hear the underlying tension. "Sir, I'm observing aircraft shadows on my wings and canopy that don't match any known profile. The shadows are moving independently and appear to be cast by aircraft flying in close formation." "Roger, Falcon 11. Continue observation and report any changes. Do not attempt to engage unless directly threatened." But even as Morrison gave the order, he knew they were already far beyond standard threat protocols. The shadows were beginning to separate from Kestrel's aircraft, peeling away like leaves in an autumn wind. But instead of falling, they climbed, rising through the thin air above 25,000 feet with impossible grace. Kestrel craned her neck to look up through the canopy, searching for the sources of the shadows that had been her companions for the past 20 minutes. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. 4 aircraft flew in perfect formation 300 feet directly above her flight, their profiles sleek and predatory against the deep blue sky. They looked like no fighter in any nation's inventory, swept wings that seemed to blur at the edges, cockpits that reflected light in patterns that hurt to look at directly, and engine exhausts that left no contrails despite the frigid altitude. But it was the pilot in the lead aircraft that made Kestrel's heart stop. Even at 300 feet, and through the distortion of 2 layers of canopy glass, she could make out the figure in the cockpit. The helmet was wrong, the flight suit was wrong, but the posture was unmistakably familiar. It was the way her father had sat in a cockpit, shoulders square, head slightly tilted, hands positioned with the unconscious precision of someone who had been flying since before she was born. Falcon Flight, this is 1-1. I have visual contact with 4 unidentified aircraft, Angels 28, maintaining formation directly above our position. Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling as she reached for her camera controls. The response from Falcon 1-2 was immediate and skeptical. Negative contact 1-1. We're showing clear skis above. Kestrel toggled her gun camera and began recording, knowing that the footage might be the only proof of what she was seeing. The lead aircraft above her was beginning a slow roll, its impossible wings catching the sunlight in ways that made her eyes water. As it rolled, she caught a glimpse of markings on the fuselage, not national insignia, but something else. Something that looked remarkably like her father's squadron badge from his classified missions in the 1990s. Viper Control. This is Falcon 1-1 requesting permission to climb and attempt visual identification of contacts. The response was immediate and firm. Negative, Falcon 1-1. Maintain current altitude and heading. Do not attempt to engage or approach the contacts. But as Kestrel watched, the lead aircraft above her began to descend, its pilot clearly intending to close the distance between them. The movement was slow and deliberate, almost ceremonial, like an ancient greeting between warriors. And as it descended, Kestrel finally understood what the shadow patch on her flight suit really meant. It wasn't a squadron insignia. It wasn't a memorial to her father's service. It was a beacon, a signal that had been calling out across time and space for 7 years, waiting for the right moment to be answered. The Falcon diving through storm clouds wasn't just diving, it was returning home. The lead aircraft leveled off just 50 feet above her Typhoon, close enough that she could see details that should have been impossible to discern through 2 layers of military-grade canopy glass. Close enough to see that the pilot looking down at her was wearing her father's face. The radio frequency erupted with overlapping transmissions as ground controllers and ship-based radar operators tried to make sense of what their instruments were telling them. But Kestrel wasn't listening to the radio anymore. She was staring up at an aircraft that shouldn't exist, piloted by a man who had died in a hospice bed 6 months ago, surrounded by medals and secrets, and the bitter knowledge that his daughter would never understand why he'd sacrificed everything to protect her from the truth. But now she was beginning to understand. The shadows hadn't been cast by aircraft above her flight. They had been cast by aircraft that existed in the spaces between moments, in the quantum foam that separated one reality from another. Her father hadn't been hallucinating during his final missions. He'd been flying escort for something that most human minds couldn't process without fracturing. The aircraft above her waggled its wings twice, a standard pilot's greeting that transcended nationality and era. Then it began to climb again, rising back toward its impossible altitude, and Kestrel knew with absolute certainty that she was about to follow it into airspace that didn't appear on any charts. She reached for her throttles, preparing to begin a climb that would either provide answers or destroy everything she thought she knew about the nature of reality itself. The shadow patch on her flight suit seemed to pulse with warmth, as if it approved of her decision. Falcon 1-1 beginning climb to Angels 30, she announced, her voice cutting through the radio chatter with quiet authority. I'm going to get some answers. The climb through 28,000 feet felt different. The air was thin enough that Kestrel could see the curvature of the Earth stretching away in all directions, but something else had changed as well. The quality of light filtering through her canopy seemed subtly altered, as if she was ascending through layers of reality itself. Her father's aircraft, and she no longer doubted that's what it was, maintained its position exactly 300 feet above her, neither pulling away nor allowing her to close the distance. Behind her, the voices of her wingmen grew increasingly concerned. Falcon 1-1, this is 2. We're showing you climbing outside authorized altitude parameters. Recommend you return to patrol altitude immediately. Falcon 113, we're not showing any contacts where you're looking. Your radar might be painting ghosts. But Kestrel's radar wasn't painting anything at all. The scope showed empty sky in all directions, even though she could clearly see 4 aircraft maintaining formation above her. It was as if they existed in a frequency her instruments couldn't detect, visible only to her eyes and perhaps to something deeper than electronic sensors. At 31,000 feet, her aircraft began to shudder slightly. The Typhoon was designed for high-altitude operations, but the air was becoming thin enough that her engines were losing efficiency. Above her, her father's aircraft seemed unaffected by atmospheric conditions that should have grounded any conventional fighter. Viper Control, this is Falcon 11. I'm observing 4 aircraft at Angels 34, configuration unknown, no IFF response. They appear to be waiting for something. The response from ground control was terse and worried. Falcon 11, you are approaching maximum service ceiling. Recommend immediate descent to patrol altitude. We're showing no contacts in your vicinity. But Kestrel was beyond caring about ground control's recommendations. At 33,000 feet, something extraordinary happened. The lead aircraft above her began to descend again, but this time it wasn't stopping at 50 feet separation. It was coming down to fly formation, wingtip to wingtip, the way she and her father had flown together during her first solo cross-country flight 15 years ago. As the unknown aircraft slid into position beside her Typhoon, Kestrel got her first clear look at technology that belonged to no nation on Earth. The cockpit canopy was completely transparent, as if made from crystallized air itself. The wings seemed to bend light around their edges, creating optical effects that made her depth perception unreliable. And the pilot? The pilot was her father, but not as she remembered him from his final years. This was Victor Voss as he had been at the height of his career, confident, alert, wearing a flight suit that bore no national insignia but carried the same shadow patch that now adorned her own uniform. He turned to look at her through the impossible transparency of his canopy, and his eyes carried the weight of 7 years' worth of explanations. He pointed downward, indicating that she should begin a descent. But instead of pointing toward the gray waters of the North Sea, he was pointing toward a coordinate that existed somewhere between here and there, between now and then. Kestrel understood instinctively that following him down would mean more than just losing altitude. She keyed her radio one final time. Viper Control, Falcon 11 beginning descent. If something happens to me up here, tell my mother that I finally understand what the patch means. Then she pushed her stick forward and followed her father's aircraft into a dive that would take her far beyond the reach of radar and radio, and everything she had ever believed about the boundaries of the possible. The descent was unlike anything in Kestrel's flying experience. Her altimeter spun wildly, showing impossible readings as if they were falling through layers of atmosphere that shouldn't exist. But her father's aircraft remained steady beside her, a fixed point of reference in a suddenly fluid reality. Through her headset, she could hear the increasingly frantic calls from her wingmen and ground control, but the voices seemed to be coming from very far away. Falcon 11, respond immediately. We're showing you in an uncontrolled descent. Falcon 11, this is SAR Control. Emergency services are being scrambled to your last known position. But Kestrel wasn't falling toward the North Sea. She was descending through something that looked like space itself, not the black vacuum of orbital space, but the deep blue-green of oceanic depths, complete with slowly drifting particles that caught the light like suspended snow. Her instruments had given up trying to make sense of their environment, showing readings that fluctuated between normal flight parameters and complete system failures. Beside her, her father's aircraft had begun to glow with a faint phosphorescence, as if it was bioluminescent rather than mechanical. Through the transparent canopy, Victor was making hand signals, the old-fashioned pilot communications they'd practiced together when she was a child learning to fly. He was telling her to follow his lead, to trust her instincts rather than her instruments, to remember that sometimes the most important navigation happened with the heart rather than the head. They leveled off at what her altimeter claimed was -5,000 feet, flying through an environment that resembled the deep ocean more than any airspace on Earth. Strange creatures drifted past her canopy, things that looked like jellyfish made of pure light, schools of fish that seemed to be constructed from solidified music. In the distance, she could see other aircraft flying in loose formation, all of them bearing the same impossible design characteristics as her father's fighter. "Welcome to the deep blue," Victor's voice came through her headset, clear and warm and exactly as she remembered it. "This is where we've been waiting for you." Kestrel tried to respond, but found her voice wouldn't work in this strange underwater sky. Instead, she could only listen as her father began to explain 7 years' worth of mysteries. The shadow patch isn't just a memorial, Kess. It's a dimensional anchor, a way of marking pilots who have seen beyond the boundaries of conventional reality. Some of us discovered it by accident during classified missions. Others, like you, inherited the ability from family members who'd already crossed over. They were approaching what looked like an underwater city, its spires and domes glowing with the same phosphorescence as her father's aircraft. Other fighters circled the structures in complex patterns, their pilots learning to navigate in 3 dimensions while dealing with physics that operated according to dream logic rather than aerodynamics. "The aircraft that have been probing your defenses," Victor continued, "they're not hostile. They're scouts, looking for pilots who can handle the transition between realities. The military calls it experimental stealth technology because they can't accept the truth, that consciousness itself can affect the behavior of matter and energy at quantum levels." As they approached the underwater city, Kestrel began to understand. The strange radar contacts, the impossible flight characteristics, the way her instruments couldn't track aircraft that her eyes could clearly see, all of it made sense if you accepted that reality was far more flexible than most people believed. "The question now," her father said gently, "is whether you're ready to learn how to fly in dimensions that don't appear on any charts." The underwater city spread out beneath them like a bioluminescent dream. Towers and spires rose from the depths, their surfaces rippling with patterns of light that seemed to respond to the movements of the aircraft above. But as they descended toward what appeared to be a landing bay, Kestrel realized that underwater wasn't quite accurate. They were flying through something that had the visual characteristics of deep ocean, but the breathing characteristics of normal atmosphere. Her father's aircraft touched down on a platform that seemed to be constructed from crystallized light, its surface solid enough to support the weight of fighters but transparent enough to reveal the vast depths below. Kestrel followed his example, her Typhoon's landing gear making contact with something that felt like metal but looked like captured starlight. As her engines spun down, she could see other pilots emerging from aircraft that defied every principle of aerodynamics she'd ever studied. Some of the fighters looked almost conventional, F-22s and Eurofighters and Rafales with subtle modifications that made them seem to bend light around their edges. Others were clearly designed for this strange underwater sky, their wings flowing like fins and their cockpits arranged in configurations that would be impossible for human pilots operating under normal G-forces. Victor was already out of his aircraft, walking across the impossible platform with the confident stride she remembered from her childhood. He was wearing a flight suit that seemed to be cut from the same crystallized light as the landing surface, and his shadow patch was glowing with soft blue luminescence. "The air here is breathable," he called to her, his voice carrying clearly across the platform despite the lack of any visible atmosphere. "But take it slow at first. The gravity works differently." Kestrel opened her canopy and immediately understood what he meant. She felt lighter than air itself, as if she could step out of her cockpit and simply float away into the glowing depths. But at the same time, she felt more substantial than she ever had before, as if every molecule of her body was more densely connected to reality. She climbed out of her Typhoon carefully, her boots making contact with the platform with a sound like wind chimes. Around her, other pilots were going through post-flight routines that looked almost normal, except for the way their movements seemed to create ripples in the air itself. "This is where RAF pilots come when they die?" she asked, though she already knew the answer wasn't quite that simple. Victor smiled, and for the first time since his death 6 months ago, he looked truly at peace. "This is where pilots come when they're ready to learn what flying really means. Death is just one way of getting here, but there are others." He gestured toward the city spreading out below them, its spires reaching both up and down in ways that made her eyes water if she tried to follow the architecture too carefully. The deep blue exists in the spaces between quantum possibilities. Every time a pilot pushes their aircraft to its absolute limits, every time someone flies with complete trust in their instincts rather than their instruments, they come a little bit closer to finding their way here. As they walked across the platform toward a structure that looked like a control tower made from compressed aurora, Kestrel began to understand the true nature of her inheritance. The shadow patch hadn't just been a memorial to her father's service. It had been a key, waiting for the right moment to unlock doors she'd never known existed. "So when I go back," she said, then paused, "I am going back, aren't I?" Victor's expression grew serious. "That depends entirely on you." The control tower's interior defied architectural logic in ways that would have given M.C. Escher nightmares. Stairs led in directions that weren't quite up or down, and windows showed views of airspace that might have been memories or might have been possibilities that hadn't happened yet. But the most disorienting aspect was the way time seemed to flow differently in different parts of the room. Victor led her to what appeared to be a briefing area, though the chairs were arranged in a circle rather than facing a podium, and the tactical displays showed aircraft movements across battlefields that spanned multiple centuries. Some of the pilots gathering for the briefing wore World War II leather jackets and oxygen masks. Others wore flight suits that looked like they belonged in science fiction films. All of them wore versions of the shadow patch that glowed with various intensities of blue light. "The deep blue has been recruiting pilots since humans first learned to leave the ground," Victor explained as they took their seats. "Lindbergh found his way here during his Atlantic crossing, though he never spoke about it publicly. Earhart was one of our best scouts before she chose a permanent assignment. Even some of the Apollo crews stumbled across dimensional boundaries during their lunar missions." The briefing officer was a woman who might have been 30 or might have been 300, wearing a flight suit that seemed to be cut from the fabric of space itself. When she spoke, her words carried harmonics that made Kestrel think of music played at frequencies only birds could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a developing situation in what you call the conventional reality. The dimensional barriers are beginning to thin, and we're seeing increased bleed-through between layers of existence. This is creating opportunities for recruitment, but it's also creating risks." The tactical displays shifted to show radar plots that looked familiar: the North Sea, the formation of Typhoons, the mysterious contacts that had been probing NATO defenses. But from this perspective, Kestrel could see the complete picture. The unidentified aircraft hadn't been testing military responses. They had been carefully mapping the consciousness patterns of individual pilots, looking for minds capable of handling dimensional transitions. "Flight Lieutenant Voss," the briefing officer continued, "your presence here represents a successful recruitment, but it's also created a paradox in the conventional timeline. Your colleagues believe you've either crashed or simply vanished from their radar screens. How we resolve this situation will determine whether the barriers between dimensions remain stable." Kestrel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the impossible physics of their environment. "What kind of paradox?" Victor answered before the briefing officer could respond. "You're existing in two states simultaneously, here in the deep blue, and in the conventional reality where your aircraft is either crashing into the North Sea or simply disappearing from radar coverage. The longer you remain here, the more difficult it becomes to maintain both states. On the tactical display, Kestrel could see her own Typhoon as her wingmen would be seeing it, beginning an uncontrolled descent toward the water, not responding to radio calls, apparently piloted by someone who had suddenly lost consciousness or suffered a catastrophic system failure. "So I have to choose," she said quietly. "Not exactly," the briefing officer replied. "You have to decide whether you're ready to begin operating in both dimensions simultaneously." The concept of existing in two dimensions at once should have been impossible to grasp, but as the briefing officer explained the mechanics of transdimensional flight operations, Kestrel found herself understanding with the same intuitive clarity that had always guided her flying. It was like learning to see with peripheral vision while maintaining forward focus, or like learning to breathe while underwater by extracting oxygen directly from H2O molecules. "The shadow patch acts as an anchor point," Victor explained, his hand unconsciously moving to touch his own glowing insignia. "It maintains a quantum entanglement between your consciousness in conventional reality and your extended awareness in the deep blue. Most pilots can only sustain this state for short periods, but some develop the ability to operate permanently across multiple dimensional layers." The briefing officer activated a three-dimensional display that showed aircraft movements across what looked like layers of transparent film, each layer representing a different level of reality. "Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to return to conventional airspace and begin training other pilots to recognize dimensional anomalies. The barriers between realities are thinning rapidly, and we need pilots who can operate effectively regardless of which layer of existence they're flying through." Kestrel studied the display, watching aircraft phase in and out of visibility as they moved between dimensional layers. Some of the transitions looked smooth and controlled, experienced pilots who had learned to navigate multiple realities with precision. Others looked chaotic and dangerous, aircraft tumbling through dimensional boundaries without proper preparation. "What happens to pilots who aren't prepared for the transition?" she asked. The briefing room fell silent. Finally, Victor spoke. "Some of them adapt and find their way here eventually. Others experience what the conventional military calls spatial disorientation or equipment malfunction. They crash, but their consciousness fragments across multiple dimensional layers, never quite able to piece together what happened to them." Kestrel thought about the pilots she'd known who had died in accidents that defied explanation, experienced aviators who had simply flown into the ground on clear days, or disappeared over open ocean despite perfect weather and functioning equipment. How many? "More than you'd think. Less than we'd like." The briefing officer's expression carried the weight of someone who had seen too many promising pilots lost to dimensional transitions they weren't prepared for. The Shadow Patch program was designed to identify and train candidates gradually, but recent events have accelerated our timeline considerably. The tactical display shifted again, showing global aviation incidents over the past decade. Red markers indicated crashes and disappearances that correlated with dimensional boundary fluctuations. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for: experienced pilots encountering phenomena their training couldn't explain, trying to process visual inputs that didn't match their instruments, ultimately losing control when reality itself became unreliable. The conventional military attributes these incidents to pilot error or equipment failure, because the alternative would require them to acknowledge that their understanding of physics is fundamentally incomplete, Victor continued. "But we can't afford to lose any more pilots to untrained dimensional transitions. The barriers are weakening, and soon every military aviator will be encountering these phenomena whether they're prepared or not." Kestrel nodded slowly, beginning to understand the scope of what she was being asked to do. "You want me to go back and start identifying other candidates?" "We want you to go back and prevent a catastrophe," the briefing officer corrected. In approximately 6 months, the dimensional barriers will become so thin that conventional aircraft will begin experiencing spontaneous transitions. Pilots who aren't prepared will start experiencing mass hallucinations, instrument failures, and navigation errors on a scale that will ground entire air forces. The weight of responsibility settled on Kestrel's shoulders like a flight suit made of lead. She thought about her squadron mates, Davies with his dry humor and steady hands, Thompson with his textbook precision, Mitchell with his aggressive confidence. None of them wore shadow patches. None of them would understand what was happening when reality began to shift around them at 30,000 feet. How do I explain any of this without sounding completely insane? Victor smiled for the first time since the briefing began. Very carefully. The same way I tried to prepare you and the way my father tried to prepare me. You start with small observations, unusual radar contacts, shadows that don't quite match the aircraft casting them. You teach them to trust their instincts when their instruments contradict what their eyes are seeing. The briefing officer stood, indicating that the session was ending. Flight Lieutenant Voss, you have approximately 30 minutes of conventional time to make your decision. After that, your current quantum state becomes unstable, and returning to single-dimensional existence will no longer be possible. As they filed out of the briefing room, Kestrel caught her father's arm. If I go back, will I see you again? Every time you look in a mirror, he replied gently. And every time you save a pilot from making a transition they're not ready for. The deep blue isn't a place you visit, Kess. It's a perspective you carry with you. The decision, when it came, felt less like choosing and more like remembering something she'd always known. Standing on the crystalline platform with her father's aircraft glowing softly beside her Typhoon, Kestrel understood that she had never really had a choice. The shadow patch had been calling her toward this moment since the day Victor had sewn it beneath her name tape, and everything that had happened since. Her training, her combat experience, even her father's death, had been preparation for what came next. I need to know how to get back here, she said, her hand resting on the transparent material of her father's canopy. Not just for myself, but for the pilots I'll be training. They'll need to know that this place exists, that there's somewhere to go when conventional reality stops making sense. Victor nodded approvingly. The deep blue exists wherever a pilot chooses to see beyond the limitations of normal perception. You don't navigate here with coordinates. You navigate with intention. When you're ready to return, simply trust that the path will appear. The return journey began with a sensation like surfacing from deep water, though Kestrel was ascending rather than rising. Her Typhoon's engines responded normally, but the aircraft itself seemed to be phasing through layers of reality like a stone skipping across multiple surfaces of a dimensional pond. Through her canopy, she could see the impossible city growing smaller below her, its spires and platforms becoming points of light that gradually faded into the blue-green depths. At what her instruments claimed was 15,000 feet, conventional physics reasserted itself with jarring suddenness. The transition was like stepping from a dream into harsh daylight. All the colors seemed too bright, all the sounds too sharp, all the sensations too immediate and limited. Her radio crackled to life with overlapping transmissions from her wingmen and ground control, their voices tight with concern and confusion. Falcon 1-1, respond immediately. We lost you on radar for approximately 8 minutes. Falcon 1-1, this is SAR control. Emergency aircraft are standing by. Please confirm your status. Kestrel keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the disorientation of existing fully in conventional reality again. Falcon 1-1 to all stations. I'm operational and returning to patrol altitude. I experienced equipment malfunction during climb. All systems now functioning normally. The relief in her flight leader's voice was audible. Roger, 1-1. Glad to have you back. We were beginning to think you'd found a way to fly through a wormhole. If only he knew, Kestrel thought. She glanced down at her shadow patch, now appearing as ordinary fabric again, though she could swear it retained a faint trace of the blue luminescence she'd seen in the deep blue. More importantly, she could feel a new layer of awareness overlaying her normal perception, a consciousness that existed partially in conventional reality and partially in the dimensional space she just visited. Falcon Flight, this is 1-1. I'm observing some unusual atmospheric conditions during climb. Recommend we maintain heightened alert status for the remainder of patrol. Copy 1-1, we'll keep our eyes open. But Kestrel knew they wouldn't see what she was beginning to see. As they resumed their patrol pattern over the North Sea, she could perceive faint traces of other aircraft operating in dimensional layers just adjacent to conventional reality. Scout ships from the deep blue, monitoring the boundaries between worlds, preparing for the day when those boundaries would become too thin to maintain separation. The shadow patch on her flight suit pulsed gently, reminding her that she now carried a responsibility that extended far beyond routine air defense missions. The following weeks brought a subtle but fundamental change to Kestrel's approach to flying. Where once she had relied primarily on instruments and radio communication, she now found herself paying equal attention to peripheral observations that couldn't be quantified or recorded. Shadows that moved independently of their sources. Radar contacts that appeared for single sweeps before vanishing. Flight characteristics in other aircraft that suggested their pilots were seeing things their instruments couldn't detect. Most significantly, she began to notice which of her fellow pilots wore expressions of barely concealed confusion during post-flight debriefings. Davies mentioned unusual cloud formations that seemed to follow his aircraft. Thompson reported radar anomalies that occurred only when he was flying alone. Mitchell admitted privately that he'd been having dreams about flying through underwater landscapes where aircraft moved like schools of fish. "It's probably just stress," Mitchell said during one of their conversations in the squadron bar. "The deployment tempo has been pretty intense lately." But Kestrel could see the shadow patch beginning to manifest itself on his flight suit, not the physical patch that marked pilots who had been formally recruited to the dimensional program, but the quantum resonance that indicated a consciousness capable of perceiving multiple layers of reality. It appeared as a barely visible distortion in the fabric above his name tape, like heat shimmer rising from summer pavement. She began incorporating subtle tests into their training flights. Formation exercises that required pilots to maintain visual contact while ignoring contradictory instrument readings. Navigation problems that could only be solved by trusting instinctive responses over calculated solutions. Combat scenarios where the enemy aircraft exhibited flight characteristics that defied conventional physics. Some of her squadron mates adapted to these exercises with surprising ease. Others struggled with increasing frustration, unable to understand why their precisely calibrated instruments were providing unreliable information. The division between natural dimensional awareness and purely conventional thinking became more apparent with each training flight. Voss, Squadron Leader Harding, called her into his office after a particularly challenging formation exercise. "I need to ask you about some of the training scenarios you've been developing. Several pilots have reported unusual experiences during these flights." Kestrel had been expecting this conversation. "What kind of experiences, sir?" "Visual contacts that don't appear on radar. Navigation anomalies that resolve themselves without explanation. Davies swears he saw another aircraft flying formation with his element yesterday, but neither his wingman nor ground control could confirm the contact." "And what's your assessment of these reports, sir?" Harding leaned back in his chair, studying her with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "My assessment is that either we're dealing with equipment malfunctions across multiple aircraft types, or we're encountering some kind of atmospheric phenomenon that affects pilot perception. But the flight data doesn't support either explanation." "There's a third possibility, sir." "Which is?" Kestrel reached into her pocket and withdrew a shadow patch identical to her own, one of several she'd been given before leaving the deep blue. We're entering a period when the boundaries between different types of airspace are becoming more fluid. Some pilots are naturally better at adapting to these conditions than others. Harding stared at the patch, his expression cycling through confusion, skepticism, and something that might have been recognition. Where did you get this? From my father. He received it during classified operations in the 1990s, operations that officially never happened. The squadron leader was quiet for a long moment, turning the patch over in his hands. The fabric seemed to shift and flow like liquid starlight, responding to his touch in ways that suggested it was constructed from materials that didn't appear in any engineering manual. If I were to authorize expanded training in unconventional flight operations, he said carefully, what would that training involve? Teaching pilots to trust their peripheral vision as much as their instruments, developing formation flying techniques that work when conventional navigation fails, learning to recognize when reality itself becomes unreliable. Harding nodded slowly, and this patch identifies pilots who are ready for advanced training. But sir, the window for preparation is closing rapidly. In a few months, every military aviator is going to encounter these phenomena whether they're trained for them or not. That evening, Squadron Leader Harding became the second member of RAF Coningsby to receive a shadow patch. The transformation of the squadron's training program happened gradually, disguised as routine preparation for classified operations that existed only in the most heavily redacted sections of the operational orders. Pilots who demonstrated natural dimensional awareness were quietly transferred to specialized flights. Those who struggled with unconventional scenarios were given additional assignments that kept them focused on strictly conventional operations. Within 2 months, 12 pilots at RAF Coningsby wore shadow patches, either openly or concealed beneath regulation name tapes. They formed the core of what would eventually become the Royal Air Force's first transdimensional reconnaissance squadron, though the official designation would remain classified for decades. The training exercises became increasingly sophisticated as the pilots developed their abilities. Formation flights through weather that existed in multiple dimensional layers simultaneously. Combat maneuvers against opposition forces that phased in and out of conventional reality. Navigation exercises that required pilots to find their way home when their instruments indicated they were flying through airspace that didn't exist on any charts. Davies proved particularly adept at long-range reconnaissance in dimensional borderlands, his calm demeanor and methodical approach making him ideal for mapping the fluctuating boundaries between realities. Thompson excelled at precision flying in unstable dimensional conditions, maintaining perfect formation even when his aircraft seemed to be flying through water instead of air. Mitchell's aggressive flying style translated surprisingly well to combat operations against opposition forces that didn't follow conventional physics. But it was Flight Lieutenant Sarah Chen who made the breakthrough that changed everything. During a routine training flight over the North Sea, she discovered that her aircraft's quantum state could be deliberately manipulated to achieve partial dimensional phase transitions while remaining in conventional airspace. I'm maintaining normal formation with Falcon 21 and 22, she reported over the radio. But I'm observing visual contacts that appear to be flying in the same formation approximately 300 feet below us. Kestrel, flying as Falcon 21, looked down through her canopy and saw Chen's aircraft clearly. But her dimensional awareness allowed her to perceive the quantum signature of Chen's Typhoon, a signature that indicated the aircraft was simultaneously occupying two slightly different positions in space-time. 2-3, can you see your own aircraft below? There was a pause before Chen responded. Affirmative. It's like looking at a reflection, but the reflection is flying independently. The tactical implications were staggering. An aircraft capable of existing in multiple dimensional layers simultaneously would be effectively invisible to conventional radar and weapons systems, while remaining fully operational in normal airspace. It would represent the ultimate stealth technology, not electronic countermeasures or advanced materials, but fundamental manipulation of the observer's relationship to reality. 2-3. Maintain current configuration and return to base for debrief. We need to document this capability immediately. But as they flew back toward RAF Koningsby, Kestrel realized they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The Shadow Patch program was no longer about preparing pilots for encounters with dimensional anomalies. It was about developing capabilities that would fundamentally alter the nature of air combat itself. The debriefing session was held in a conference room that had been hastily cleared of all recording equipment and staffed only by personnel who wore shadow patches. Chen's gun camera footage showed normal formation flying, but the computer analysis revealed subtle anomalies in the aircraft's radar signature that suggested quantum state fluctuations. "The good news," reported the intelligence officer, "is that we've discovered a capability that could revolutionize air warfare. The bad news is that we have no idea how to control it, replicate it, or predict when it might happen spontaneously." Chen herself seemed remarkably unaffected by the experience. "It felt completely natural once I stopped trying to force it, like the aircraft wanted to exist in multiple places simultaneously, and I just had to stop preventing it from doing so." Squadron Leader Harding studied the technical readouts with the expression of someone trying to reconcile physics textbooks with observable reality. "Flight Lieutenant Voss, your assessment." "I believe we're seeing the emergence of capabilities that have always existed, but were suppressed by conventional training and expectations. The Shadow Patch doesn't grant abilities. It removes mental barriers that prevent pilots from accessing their full potential." And the strategic implications. Kestrel thought about the briefing she'd attended in the Deep Blue, the warnings about dimensional barriers weakening, and the timeline for spontaneous transitions affecting all military aviation. "Sir, I believe we're at the leading edge of a fundamental shift in the nature of aerial warfare. Within months, every air force in the world will be dealing with pilots who spontaneously develop these capabilities." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Air superiority based on advanced technology and superior training would become meaningless if some pilots could phase their aircraft through conventional reality at will. Combat formations would need to account for aircraft that might suddenly become invisible to sensors or weapons. Navigation systems would require complete overhaul to function in airspace, where the laws of physics operated according to quantum probability rather than Newtonian mechanics. "Recommendations," Harding asked quietly. "Expand the program immediately. Identify and train as many pilots as possible before the spontaneous transition phase begins, and prepare to rewrite every tactical manual in our inventory." But even as she spoke, Kestrel could sense through her dimensional awareness that they were already running out of time. The barriers between realities were thinning faster than anticipated, and somewhere in the cold waters of the North Sea, aircraft from the Deep Blue were beginning to manifest in conventional airspace with increasing frequency. The first confirmed sighting by civilian observers occurred 3 days later. A North Sea oil platform reported multiple aircraft performing what appeared to be combat maneuvers at impossible altitudes and speeds. The aircraft exhibited flight characteristics that violated every known principle of aerodynamics, including 90-degree turns at supersonic speed and sustained flight, while completely inverted for periods exceeding 30 minutes. Military radar installations confirmed the sightings, but could provide no identification of the aircraft types or their points of origin. The radar signatures appeared and disappeared randomly, sometimes showing formation flights of up to 12 aircraft, other times indicating single contacts that seemed to split into multiple targets before reunifying without apparent cause. HMS Queen Elizabeth, still operating in the Norwegian Sea, reported visual contact with aircraft that appeared to be constructed from crystallized light rather than conventional materials. The formations flew past the carrier at extremely low altitude, but produced no detectable sound signatures despite apparent supersonic speeds. Most disturbing of all, several civilian and military pilots reported radio transmissions on emergency frequencies that consisted of what sounded like normal air traffic control communications, but using call signs that didn't correspond to any registered aircraft and referring to navigational aids that didn't exist on any published charts. The phenomenon was spreading. Similar reports began coming in from air traffic control centers across northern Europe. The Scandinavian air forces reported unprecedented numbers of unidentified contacts operating in their sovereign airspace. French and German controllers logged hundreds of radar tracks that exhibited impossible flight characteristics before vanishing from their scopes. Kestrel realized that the spontaneous transition phase had already begun. The 6-month timeline from her briefing in the deep blue had been overly optimistic. Dimensional barriers were collapsing much faster than anticipated, and conventional military aviation was about to encounter phenomena for which no amount of training could adequately prepare unprepared pilots. "Sir," she told Squadron Leader Harding during an emergency briefing, "we need to accelerate the Shadow Patch program immediately, and we need to start making contact with our counterparts in other air forces. This isn't going to remain a purely British phenomenon much longer." Harding nodded grimly. "I've already been in contact with NATO headquarters. They're convening an emergency meeting of all Air Force commanders next week. Apparently, we're not the only ones dealing with unexplained aerial phenomena." "What's the official explanation going to be?" "Experimental aircraft being tested by an unknown nation, possibly advanced drones using new propulsion systems, the usual cover stories." Kestrel thought about the pilots who would soon be encountering aircraft that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, who would be forced to engage targets that could phase in and out of conventional reality at will. "Sir, respectfully, the cover stories aren't going to work much longer. Reality itself is becoming unreliable. We need to start preparing people for that." "One step at a time, Flight Lieutenant. First, we expand the Shadow Patch program to allied air forces. Then we start developing tactical procedures for operations in unstable dimensional conditions." But as they spoke, Kestrel's dimensional awareness was detecting the approach of something massive moving through the layers of reality above the base. Something that would force their hand much sooner than anyone anticipated. The massive presence Kestrel had sensed resolved itself into visible reality during the evening shift change at RAF Koningsby. Personnel walking between buildings stopped and stared upward, as what appeared to be a floating city materialized in the sky above the base, its crystalline spires catching the last light of the setting sun and refracting it into patterns that painted aurora across the clouds. The city was clearly not of human construction. Its architecture flowed like music made visible, with towers that spiraled in directions that seemed to twist through dimensions rather than simply rising vertically. Gardens of impossible plants cascaded from floating platforms, their bioluminescent flowers creating rivers of light that flowed upward through the twilight sky. But most significantly, the city was launching aircraft. Hundreds of fighters poured from bays that opened like iris apertures in the city's crystalline hull. They moved with the fluid grace that Kestrel recognized from her time in the deep blue, their formations shifting and flowing like schools of fish, responding to currents that existed in dimensions beyond normal perception. The base's air defense systems went a full alert within minutes, but their radar painted a confused picture of targets that appeared and disappeared seemingly at random. Missile locks couldn't be maintained on aircraft that phased in and out of conventional reality mid-flight. Even visual tracking became difficult as the dimensional fighters seemed to bend light around themselves in ways that made depth perception unreliable. All personnel to emergency stations. Squadron Leader Harding's voice echoed across the base's public address system. We are experiencing an unidentified aerial incursion. This is not a drill. But Kestrel knew this wasn't an attack. As she ran toward the squadron-ready room, her shadow patch was pulsing with warm blue light, and through her dimensional awareness, she could sense the peaceful intentions of the approaching formations. This was the recruitment mission she'd been warned about, the final phase of the Shadow Patch program, when the barriers between realities became so thin that large-scale contact between dimensions became inevitable. In the ready room, pilots were suiting up for immediate launch, with expressions that ranged from grim determination to barely controlled panic. Most of them had never seen anything like the formations approaching the base, and their training provided no framework for understanding what they were observing. "Listen to me," Kestrel called out, raising her voice above the chaos of preparation. "The aircraft approaching us are not hostile. They're here for the same reason we've been conducting unconventional training exercises. Some of you are going to be invited to participate in operations that extend beyond conventional airspace." Davies looked up from checking his flight suit, his expression skeptical but not dismissive. Invited by whom? By pilots who learned to fly in dimensions we're only beginning to understand. My father was one of them. Now it's our turn. Thompson finished strapping on his helmet and turned to face her. "And if we decline the invitation? Then you continue flying conventional missions until the dimensional barriers weaken enough that every military aviator encounters these phenomena, whether they're prepared or not." Through the ready room windows, they could see the floating city settling into a stable hover approximately 5,000 feet above the base. Aircraft continued to stream from its bays, but now they were forming escort formations rather than tactical approaches. The message was clear. This was an invitation, not an invasion. Squadron Leader Harding entered the ready room at a run, his face flushed from sprinting across the base. "Change of orders. We're launching 4 aircraft on reconnaissance rather than intercept. Volunteers only, and only pilots wearing shadow patches." Kestrel wasn't surprised when Davies, Thompson, and Chen stepped forward without hesitation. The launch into dimensional airspace felt different from any training exercise they'd conducted. As soon as their Typhoons left the runway, they were surrounded by escort aircraft that seemed to be constructed from solidified light and shadow. The pilots of these dimensional fighters were clearly visible through their impossible canopies, and Kestrel was amazed to recognize some of them from historical photographs in the Squadron Heritage Room. "Falcon Flight this is. Well, I suppose I should say this is Group Captain Sir Douglas Bader." A familiar voice crackled through their headsets with the distinctive cadence of a Battle of Britain veteran. "Welcome to the real war, chaps. Hope you're ready for some proper flying." The formation climbed toward the floating city through air that seemed to sparkle with possibility. Below them, RAF Coningsby looked like a postage stamp against the landscape of Lincolnshire. Above them, the crystalline spires of the dimensional city grew larger and more magnificent with each 1,000 feet of altitude. "The city is called Ethanis," Bader's voice continued, warm with pride and nostalgia. "It's where pilots go when they're ready to learn that the sky has no limits. Your father helped design some of the training facilities, Miss Voss. He's quite eager to show you what real formation flying looks like." As they approached the city's landing bays, Kestrel realized that this moment represented the end of one phase of her life and the beginning of something unprecedented in human history. Conventional military aviation was about to be permanently transformed by contact with civilizations that had learned to navigate the deeper currents of reality itself. The shadow patch on her flight suit pulsed with anticipation, as their aircraft were guided toward landing platforms that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The landing bay of Athenis defied every architectural principle Kestrel had ever studied. The platform extended infinitely in all directions, while somehow remaining small enough to accommodate their 4 Typhoons with room to spare. The walls curved away into distances that might have been miles or might have been inches, depending on how you chose to perceive them. As her aircraft touched down on crystalline material that felt solid but looked like captured starlight, Kestrel could see hundreds of other aircraft parked in formations that organized themselves according to the dreams and intentions of their pilots rather than conventional logic. World War II Spitfires sat alongside sleek fighters that belonged to no earthly air force. Modern F-22s were parked next to aircraft that looked like they had been grown rather than built. But most remarkably, every aircraft bore some version of the shadow patch, the diving falcon that marked pilots who had learned to navigate between dimensions of reality. Victor Voss was waiting for them as they climbed out of their cockpits, but he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a tall woman in an RAF uniform that seemed to be cut from the same crystalline material as the landing platform. Her wings bore the insignia of an Air Commodore, and her shadow patch glowed with the deep blue intensity that marked senior pilots in the dimensional service. "Welcome to the real Royal Air Force," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding operations that spanned multiple realities. "I'm Air Commodore Margaret Thorne, Commanding Officer of Dimensional Command. Your conventional training ends here. Your education in what flying really means begins now." Davies, Thompson, and Chen looked around the impossible hangar with expressions that cycled through disbelief, wonder, and a growing sense that everything they'd believed about the nature of reality had been fundamentally incomplete. But Kestrel could see in their eyes the same recognition she'd felt during her first visit to the deep blue. This wasn't alien or impossible. It was simply larger than they'd been taught to imagine. "The floating city," Thompson asked, "is it some kind of spacecraft?" Air Commodore Thorne smiled. "Athenis is what you get when an entire civilization learns to build with consciousness instead of matter. It's been humanity's dimensional command center for the better part of a century, though most humans remained unaware of its existence until the barriers began weakening." She led them through corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves to accommodate their movement, past windows that showed views of Earth from angles that shouldn't have been possible. In some windows, they could see conventional aircraft going about their routine missions, unaware that their airspace was shared with formations from multiple dimensional layers. In others, they could observe the flow of dimensional barriers themselves, rippling like aurora through the fabric of space-time. "Your mission," Thorne continued as they walked, "is to return to conventional operations and begin preparing your Air Force for full-scale dimensional integration. The barriers are weakening so rapidly that within weeks, spontaneous transitions will become commonplace. Pilots who aren't prepared will begin experiencing what appears to be mass hallucinations, equipment failures, and navigation errors." They entered a briefing room that looked remarkably similar to conventional military facilities, except that the tactical displays showed aircraft movements across multiple layers of reality simultaneously. Pilots from various eras and air forces sat around a conference table that seemed to extend into infinity in both directions, while remaining intimate enough for normal conversation. "The situation is accelerating beyond our original projections," Thorne explained, activating displays that showed dimensional barrier measurements from around the globe. "We had hoped to have another year for gradual recruitment and training. Instead, we have perhaps 6 weeks before conventional military aviation encounters phenomena that will fundamentally challenge every assumption about the nature of flight." Kestrel studied the global data, noting hotspots where barrier degradation was occurring most rapidly. "The North Sea region appears to be ground zero for the accelerated timeline." "Correct. Something about the intersection of multiple weather patterns and magnetic field variations has created ideal conditions for dimensional instability, but the phenomenon is spreading. Similar conditions are developing over the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and the Arctic Ocean. Victor stepped forward, his expression grave. Which means every major air force in the world is about to encounter aircraft and flight conditions that their current training cannot prepare them for. We need to expand the Shadow Patch program globally, and we need to do it immediately. The weight of responsibility settled on the four pilots like a heavy flight suit. They were being asked to return to their conventional commands and begin preparing their air forces for a transformation in the nature of flight itself. A transformation that most senior officers would be psychologically incapable of accepting. How do we convince people that reality is more flexible than they've been taught to believe? Davies asked quietly. Air Commodore Thorne's expression softened slightly. The same way every generation of pilots has learned to push beyond the limitations of their predecessors, one flight at a time, one mind at a time, and with absolute confidence that the sky has no limits for those who are brave enough to explore its full dimensions. As their briefing concluded, and they prepared to return to conventional airspace, Kestrel realized that the Shadow Patch had never been just a memorial to her father's service or a symbol of elite pilot status. It was a promise, a commitment to flying not just through the three dimensions of normal space, but through the infinite dimensions of human possibility itself. The flight back to RAF Coningsby took place through air that seemed more substantial than before, as if their visit to Ethanus had permanently altered their relationship with the medium through which they flew. Their aircraft responded to control inputs with a sensitivity that bordered on telepathic, and their formation flying achieved a precision that would have been impossible using conventional techniques. But the most significant change was in their perception of the airspace around them. Where once they had seen empty sky between their aircraft and the ground, now they could perceive layers of activity that existed in adjacent dimensional frequencies. Ghost squadrons of aircraft from multiple eras flew in formations that overlapped and intersected with their own without any risk of collision. Weather patterns extended through dimensions of time as well as space, creating atmospheric conditions that responded to the emotional states of the pilots flying through them. Falcon Flight, this is Coningsby Tower. Please confirm your position. We're showing you on approach, but your radar signature is unusual. Kestrel keyed her microphone, realizing that their aircraft were probably flickering in and out of conventional radar coverage as they transitioned between dimensional layers. Tower, Falcon Flight is 5 miles out on final approach. All aircraft operational. Roger, Falcon Flight. Be advised we're showing intermittent contacts that appear to be flying in formation with your flight. Through her dimensional awareness, Kestrel could see the escort aircraft from Ethanus that were accompanying them back to base, insurance against any difficulties they might experience transitioning from dimensional to conventional airspace. But to conventional radar, they would appear as ghost contacts that defied explanation. Tower, the additional contacts are friendly aircraft conducting evaluation of new stealth systems. They'll depart the area once we're safely on deck. It was becoming easier to provide cover stories that contained just enough truth to be believable while avoiding explanations that would challenge the fundamental assumptions of conventional military thinking. The Shadow Patch program had always operated in the spaces between official doctrine and observable reality. As they touched down on the familiar runway of RAF Coningsby, Kestrel felt the jarring transition back to purely conventional existence. The crystalline clarity of dimensional awareness faded to a background hum, though it never disappeared entirely. Her aircraft felt heavier, less responsive, constrained by the laws of physics in ways that now seemed artificial and limiting. In the post-flight debriefing, Squadron Leader Harding listened to their carefully edited account of the reconnaissance mission, with the expression of someone trying to reconcile official policy with undeniable reality. They described observing advanced aircraft with unprecedented capabilities, unusual atmospheric conditions that affected instrument readings, and communication with pilots using call signs that didn't appear in any conventional database. "Your assessment of the threat level?" he asked finally. "No threat detected, sir," Davies responded. "The aircraft we observed demonstrated peaceful intentions and superior capabilities that make any hostile action inadvisable. Recommendations for future encounters." Kestrel spoke carefully. "Continue expanding unconventional flight training. Prepare pilots to operate effectively when instruments provide unreliable information, and consider establishing communication protocols for encounters with aircraft that operate using non-standard flight characteristics." That evening, as the four pilots sat in the squadron bar processing what they had experienced, Chen raised the question that had been weighing on all their minds. How many people are we going to be able to convince before the barriers collapse completely? "Probably not enough," Thompson replied quietly. "But maybe enough to prevent complete chaos when every military pilot in the world starts seeing aircraft that don't appear on radar." Kestrel traced the outline of her shadow patch through the fabric of her flight suit. "We start with our own squadron. Then we expand to other RAF bases. If we can establish a core group of pilots who understand what's happening, they can serve as anchors when reality starts becoming unreliable for everyone else." But even as she spoke, her dimensional awareness was detecting signs that the accelerated timeline was proceeding faster than anyone had anticipated. Somewhere in the night sky above Lincolnshire, aircraft from multiple eras and realities were beginning to converge for what felt like a final gathering before the barriers between dimensions became too thin to maintain any separation at all. The convergence began at dawn. Kestrel was awakened by her shadow patch pulsing with urgent blue light, and through her dimensional awareness, she could sense massive formations gathering in the airspace above not just RAF Coningsby, but above every major air base in the United Kingdom. Similar gatherings were taking place over military installations across Europe, North America, and Asia as pilots from the Dimensional Service prepared for the final phase of the integration process. She dressed quickly and made her way to the Squadron Operations Center, where she found Davies, Thompson, and Chen already monitoring radio frequencies that carried transmissions in languages that predated recorded history, alongside modern air traffic control communications in accents that belonged to no earthly nation. "It's happening globally," Davies reported, his voice tight with controlled tension. "Every major air force is reporting massive formations of unidentified aircraft that appear and disappear without warning. Some of them are trying to scramble interceptors, but their missiles are passing harmlessly through targets that seem to be constructed from solid light." Squadron Leader Harding arrived at a run, his face flushed, and his expression cycling between professional calm and barely suppressed panic. "NATO headquarters is convening an emergency session. The Americans are considering elevating to DEFCON 2. The Russians are claiming this is some kind of first strike using technology they don't recognize." "Sir," Kestrel said carefully, "I believe this is the recruitment phase we've been preparing for. The aircraft are here to identify and train pilots who are capable of operating in unstable dimensional conditions. And the pilots who aren't capable,